This is a story from Video Games Chronicle, and I thought it was interesting. Phil Spencer, long cast as Xbox's savior, may be remembered as the man who killed it. Interesting. Hit points. Now that all his big bets have failed, Spencer is turning to corrective measures. This is interesting. I mean, basically, it goes through some information when he spoke at GDC last week, offering some context and spin on Microsoft's recent maneuvers while dropping a few now customary hints about Xbox's division's future plans. It's interesting. Like, Xbox has always been fighting a bit of an uphill battle. Not always, but since like the PS4 gen, they've really struggled. And most of their current problems go back to the Xbox One announcement. I mean, that's where all of this started to really crumble. Because at a pivotal point where people could choose which gaming device did they want to double down on, Xbox screwed up and decided to try and frame the Xbox One as a cable box that also played games. Who thought that was a good idea is the question of the century. I mean, the people that were responsible for it all lost their jobs, left to other companies, and like, they basically cleaned house because it was such a colossal miscalculation on Xbox's part. But as a result, PlayStation dominated the PS4 gen and became the de facto like platform for gamers at the core. And Xbox has been trying to play catch up ever since. So they had a huge fan base, and they had a ton of gamers connected and committed in the 360 gen. And all of that progress was lost in the PS4 gen. They've been trying to dig themselves out of it ever since. What they found, though, was that once they started making acquisitions, and once Phil Spencer started to take over, they realized, for one, it's really tough to do what Sony's been doing, which is to have a handful of studios that make AAA budget or even quadruple A budget, third-person adventure games, narrative games that are captivating, compelling, cinematic, that drive sales, win Game of the Year. It's very, very difficult to do that on a consistent basis. Even when they've thought that they had games that were going to be like that, they end up flopping or just not being received that well. You know, they could, even when they pour money and time into it, like with Halo Infinite, the game can be received pretty well, but it's not the savior that they needed. Even with something like Starfield, world-class studio, right? Plenty of time, right? Plenty of money, right? And then they put it out and it's just not good enough. So they decided not to rely too much on those heavy hitters. Instead, you know, if you think of it like an RPG or something, instead of going for like a high crit build, they're trying to go for like a slow burning status effect build, where like they build poison effects onto you or fire or burning damage or something. That's what they're going for. And the way they're doing that is by making a ton of acquisitions, selling you Game Pass that you pay for monthly. So on a month-to-month basis, you're spending more money consistently than you would be on PlayStation. And even though they don't get the benefit of huge out of the park hits or critical hits, they still are doing well. You know, it's a nice alternative. Oh, Jesus, I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Oscar, for the $2. Appreciate you. So that's been their strategy. If they can't beat PlayStation at the heavy hitters, they're going to have some softer hitters, but they're going to have a lot of them very consistently. Problem has been that they have not been consistent in that last part. They certainly have a lot of games. They certainly have a lot of studios, but they've failed at getting them out consistently. They hope to remedy that in the next like year or two, as they've taken some time to reschedule and make sure that everything's kind of lined up for a steady pace of games, but that's certainly been a struggle for them up to this point. However, all of this has kind of led to a broader brand identity, which is that now Xbox's goal is to have games available on all platforms, whether it's Xbox, sometimes PlayStation as well, but certainly Xbox, PC, and xCloud at the very least. And that starts to lead people to ask, why should I own an Xbox if I could just have the Xbox app on my PC? Why not just buy a PC and a PlayStation? Why do I need to buy an Xbox if I can just play this on my phone and all this? And it leads to people wondering what the point of the hardware is. And I think it's a valid question. And it's clear that the Xbox as a piece of hardware has become a secondary concern. It's not the focus of the business anymore. And I think this is a key thing that has to be understood before discussing any of this stuff, is that PlayStation's business model is built around having high quality games that sell you on the hardware. And once you're a member of the hardware ecosystem, you're going to be more likely to spend much more money on other secondary things and you know, the things off the PlayStation store that they get 30% cuts of. So PlayStation's whole goal, it's similar to like Apple, is to sell you the piece of hardware, get you hooked on the hardware so that you don't leave, because once you get really hooked onto like The Last of Us, swapping to Xbox or swapping wholly to PC doesn't seem that viable, because you'll be losing out on those games and subsequent things, because it's not available on those platforms. So that's PlayStation's model, is selling you hardware, getting hooked on the ecosystem. For Xbox, their goal is different. Their goal is to sell you a subscription service that's available, hopefully for them, anywhere. So their goal is not the hardware. If you buy their hardware, cool, but their goal is to get you to sign up for the subscription model. And it's a very similar thing as they've done elsewhere within Microsoft. The Microsoft Office suite, for example, is a phenomenal set of tools. Whether you look at Microsoft Word or PowerPoint or Excel or whatever, many of these are standards, even Microsoft Teams. Many of these are standards within other companies. There was that famous picture that went viral of Tim Cook when he was at like a press event or something, and he had his Apple Watch on and he's shaking hands with somebody, and a Microsoft Outlook notification pops up on his watch as he's taking pictures and shaking hands with somebody. And everybody's like, look, even the head of Apple isn't using the Mail app. He's using the Microsoft email app because it's just better than anything his company has. And that's kind of the core idea behind Microsoft's strategy, is that they want to have the best software regardless of what platform. So if that means they bring it to Mac, they bring it to Mac. If that means they make games and they bring it to PlayStation, they bring it to PlayStation. That's their goal. And it's very different from PlayStation's methodology, and it does lead into instances where all of a sudden you don't feel that compelled to buy an Xbox. In the same way, like you can buy a Windows PC that's not made by Microsoft. You can buy a Microsoft Surface if you want, but if you also buy a Lenovo, if you also go and buy an HP or whatever else, as long as it's using Windows, Microsoft is still winning as far as they're concerned. So it seems like they're taking an approach that is closer to what they've done on the PC side of things than what Sony has done with the gaming side of things. And that is why it feels so markedly different, is that they've just determined that their strategy to try and play PlayStation's game, it just hasn't really worked. So they're trying something different, which is to basically just turn it into Windows and try to sell it and price everything accordingly. So speaking to Polygon, which has chopped the interview up into multiple news pieces in classic early 2010 style, Spencer lamented that the games industry simply isn't growing enough, explaining that all of Microsoft's recent moves, the acquisition of Blizzard, concessions, the decision to take Xbox exclusive to PS5 and or Switch, the layoffs have been designed to counter this unavoidable, irrefutable truth. Without new customers, Spencer says, quote, everybody else's customer is your success state. You can't succeed unless you draw in customers from other publishers and other platforms. And because you're not finding new customers with the games that you're building, everybody's kind of fighting over the same size pie. When you have an industry that is projected to be smaller next year in terms of players and dollars, and you get a lot of publicly traded companies that are in that industry that have to show their investors growth, because why does somebody own a share of somebody's stock if it's not going to grow? The side of the business that then gets scrutinized is the cost side, because if you're not going to grow the revenue side, then the cost side becomes challenged, which is absolutely the case. I mean, it's like what we said earlier when we were talking about the revenue splits with PlayStation, where their margins are too tight. If this middle dividing line, you know, this is the expense side, and then this is the profit side, and you are dealing with fixed revenue, you know this number isn't going up. You need to make the green grow. You need to make this bigger no matter what. Otherwise, stock prices drop. It's all these guys are hired to do, is to make green number go up. And how do they do that? If this number isn't going to grow, they have to lower this bar. They have to lower the expenses so that this line ends up lower. There's more green. That number went up even though the revenue stayed the same, right? That's all he's saying, is that if it's not going to grow, we have to cut so that we still end up with more profit at the end of the day. How they do that is by canceling projects, by downsizing, by trying to increase profitability in various ways. That's how they do that. Business 101 but it is just the situation that we're dealing with. They say in this op-ed, now look, Spencer is right to a degree, and if this were coming from a punter, a rank and file developer at a random game studio, or a modestly successful newsletter idiot, it would be fair, or would be a fair comment maybe. But Phil, mate, I'm sorry to have to point this out to you, but you're the head of Xbox. Yes. I'm not sure you get to pin all this on the macroeconomic this and that, you know? You have had, I think it fair to say, a degree of agency in all this. Indeed, there are maybe half a dozen people with the power to actually change the shape of the games industry, and for the last 10 years, you have been one of them. I do not see much point in dwelling on how we got here, because I think it is quite obvious to us all what's gone wrong. All of Spencer's big bets, the pivot to subscriptions, the variable hardware SKUs, the spending spree of studio acquisitions, were contingent on Xbox not just being, to borrow Xbox's tagline, the best place to play, but the best place to play the best games. If there's one lesson we can take from Spencer's era, it's that you can enact all the disruptive change you want, but you cannot disprove the industry's oldest truth. Great games sell consoles. $100 billion later, Xbox still doesn't have them. If anything, I would argue its first-party output has gotten worse since the shopping spree began, and its struggles are, as such, no surprise at all. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, I guess it's just, you can say it's Phil's fault that the industry is the way that it is. And I would agree, like the multiple hardware SKUs, the Series S paired with the Series X, I don't think was the best choice when you consider everything. You know, I think you could have done a Series X with a disk drive and then one without that had maybe more storage or something. You know, you could have done that to have a lower priced option, but I agree that was probably a mistake. I don't think the pivot to subscriptions has been generally that big of a blunder for Xbox. They still insist that it's profitable. They don't share direct numbers, but they still insist Xbox Game Pass is profitable. They probably aren't factoring in the cost of acquisitions to it on the whole. Like, it's not like this year they're going to count $70 billion, or last year they counted $70 billion as part of the equation. But I do think that they probably break it up over however long it's financed over, or however else they've done it. They have good accountants, to say the very least. But whether you blame Phil Spencer or not, you're still dealing with the same problem, which is that this number is not growing. And that's not just for Xbox, that's true of most big publishers, which is why you're seeing layoffs industry-wide. I mean, it's just people are getting more picky with the games. And part of that is because quality has taken a bit of a nosedive, and at least in terms of consistency. There's a lot of huge AAA, and dare I say quadruple A games that cost $70, which are garbage. And that's made people more skeptical. That's made people more cautious. They don't want to buy a game on launch day unless it's like a 9 or a 10 out of 10. And we've seen that all over the place. I mean, like even when Starfield was reviewed and launched, people saw that it was getting like 8 out of 10s and people were losing their minds. You're like, wow, Xbox blows it again. And I'm like, I'm not a huge fan of Starfield, but it didn't review terribly. You know, it just didn't review as a masterpiece or anything. It was a pretty good game. Like worst case scenario, it's a fine game, but people acted like it was the end of the world because they expected a masterpiece, and they've become accustomed to, I think in 2023 especially, a lot of masterpieces. You know, 2023 is a very special year. But there's just been a lot of games that have led to people feeling like they've wasted their money. And that's contributed to this problem where people now are not spending as freely. And there's other macroeconomic things like inflation and,
Valencia donated $4,
you know, wages not increasing, but still. So I guess with all this, I don't really see what the point is, whether you blame Phil Spencer or not for the current state of the industry. The current state of the industry is what it is. And it's just, they have to find other ways of doing things because what Xbox has been doing is not working, so they're trying something different. Spencer spent part of his Polygon interview musing airily about a dedicated Xbox handheld device, which I'm sure seems like a no-brainer in a world where the Steam Deck exists, but I imagine it will be an alarming prospect for a developer community that is slowly cottoning? I haven't really seen that used before. Cottoning on to the fact that making games for Xbox is too much of a faff. What are these words? They pulled out the thesaurus full force, something that takes a lot of effort and causes slight problems. Okay. Who knew? Pulling out these words. And then cottoning. I haven't heard that used casually in a gaming article before. Phrasal verb of cotton. Begin to understand. Okay, who knew? The more you know. Gaming Industry Biz, or gamesindustry.biz, Chris Dring returned from GDC with tales of publishers questioning their future support of the platform that bakes in so much risk. A dominant subscription service cannibalizing game sales, the need to ensure parity across Series S and X, and further increasing sky-high development costs while doing it. And it offers such a small audience in return. Now you want a handheld version as well? Best of luck with that. I mean, that's fair. I mean, I do think that, again, the Series S has complicated things where a lot of developers are like kind of tempted not to. And the other big piece is you see a lot of games, if they launch on Xbox, what do people say if it's kind of like a 7? People are like, I'll wait for Game Pass. And that for devs is not what you want to hear, because if you don't intend on it coming to Game Pass, people are just not buying it. They're like, yeah, I'll wait for some future date, whatever. Don't think about it right now. It's just crazy. It's a serious problem. It's a cascading kind of legacy or secondary. It's like an externality of Game Pass that probably wasn't really anticipated, where Xbox's Game Pass is such a good value that it's led to people expecting much better value than they got in years past. So they expect if it's $70, they're going to get, a 9 or a 10 out of 10. Whereas before, like a $60, $70 game was like, yeah, if it's like an 8 out of 10, it might be worth its price. But in the age of Game Pass, it's like, yeah, well, compared to Game Pass, this is way overpriced, so it's just not worth trying. So it's definitely complicated things. Now that all of his big bets have failed, Spencer is turning to corrective measures, short-term fixes that might juice the numbers in the next couple of P&Ls, but seem destined to further weaken the Xbox ecosystem down the line. Bringing the likes of Epic Game Store and itch.io to Xbox consoles could confuse the value proposition, giving users more ways to give money to people that aren't Microsoft and do nothing to transform Xbox's futures. I would love to have my itch library on a console, don't get me wrong, but if Spencer thinks that's going to move the needle in any meaningful way, then I have some magic beans to sell him. And if he thinks that this is a two-way street, the first step on a journey that ends with Game Pass on PS5, Switch, and Steam, then he has truly lost the plot. Yeah, I don't think Game Pass ends up on Steam, Switch, or PS5. Maybe you get xCloud on like the next Switch, maybe. But even then, that might be a stretch, because like Nintendo might make a policy where it's like, yeah, you can have no data streaming or no game streaming services on the app or anything, like, because they want you to buy them through their stores. So that's why PlayStation's never going to make it available on their platform. It just wouldn't make sense. Let's see. Taking former exclusives to rival platforms is yet more short-term thinking. Sure, it may pump the numbers a bit, but each new port is one less reason for a potential new customer to buy an Xbox, and one more reason for Xbox owners to switch sides and abandon the platform for good. Once again, I cannot see a way in which this ends with Xbox as we know it today getting stronger. That's the key thing, though, is I do think the Xbox as we know it today, or as we've known it for decades past, I think that Xbox is gone. They're trying to transition, it seems, from a hardware console platform into a subscription service. So yeah, I mean, I think this is the key thing. Xbox, I think, already has changed and is no longer the company you might have known from years past. Let us assume charitably that Sea of Thieves sells 5 million copies at $40 a pop when it launches on PS5 next month. Let us even more charitably pretend that means $200 million in revenue from Xbox, ignoring distributing and marketing Sony's platform cut and the cost of making the port in the first place. Last quarter, $200 million would have increased Microsoft's revenue by 0.3%. That is merely a rounding error for a company of that size, and where the health of its gaming division is concerned, it's little more than a sticking plaster. To be clear, I feel bad for Spencer. He seems a decent sort. I think he's come into this with the best of intentions, and in a parallel universe where every horse he backed romped home, he would be credited with transforming or perhaps even saving the games industry. In another, where spending $70 billion on Activision Blizzard, he spent it on 230 odd games with the same budget as Spider-Man 2. Perhaps Xbox is flying. But in our world, he has spent 10 years and a gargantuan amounts of money taking Xbox from third place to third place, and that is not the market's fault. If the writing isn't on the wall for Xbox as a whole, then it certainly could be for him. Oh, baby. Savage. Yeah, layoffs all over the industry. CEOs looking for other ways to get making games profitable again, global poverty rising. But guess what? It's all Phil's fault and his damn Game Pass putting Xbox game on other consoles. I mean, I get what they're saying though. Instead of spending $70 billion on Activision, he spent it on 230 odd games with the same budget as Spider-Man 2. Perhaps Xbox is flying. I mean, Spider-Man 2 kind of budget is the reason why Sony made low margin or low profit on those games, even when they sold millions. That's the reason they've been closing down studios. They spend too much. Sales are not strong enough to recoup the investments. Industry has gone or has to go for smaller games, not bigger ones. It's not sustainable. Brain Dead article, PlayStation thrives having a handful of exclusive each generation, yet Xbox lets some smaller games go multi-platform and it's the end of the world. I mean, I get what he's saying. I get the argument. It's that at the end of the day, they've spent so much money and they're still in third place. The Xbox brand is confused and there's less reason seemingly than ever to buy an Xbox device. I get that. But I think it's because Xbox is trying to change things. They're not focused entirely on selling the box like they were in 2005. Their goal now is to sell the software where margins are much higher. That just makes more sense. So that's what they're doing. And if you buy one of their games on Steam, if you buy it through Xbox, if you buy Game Pass and play it that way, they're happy because they're making money regardless. That's the point. And so many of these articles, they often just come down to like, Xbox is, as we know it, is dying. And it's like, yeah, but it's changing and they're trying to do something else that's proven successful in other realms. That's okay. Like that, I don't think that's a problem. It's just different. Maybe it ends up causing like everything to just implode. Maybe it causes, you know, PlayStation to just grow monopolistic and things get super toxic. We'll see when we get there, but I don't think Xbox is like disappearing. I think Xbox is changing a lot, and it's going to be interesting to see kind of how the cookie crumbles.